On a quiet morning in a small Welsh village, children gathered for school beneath a mountain that had always been there. It did not erupt, collapse suddenly, or give a clear warning. It moved slowly, silently, and with deadly certainty. What followed was not the result of nature alone, but of years of ignored concerns, postponed decisions, and responsibility passed upward until it vanished. This is the story of Aberfan, where a disaster was not inevitable, but allowed. Aberfan was a small mining village in South Wales, shaped entirely by coal. Nearly every family depended on the nearby colliery, and for generations the industry had defined work, routine, and survival. The hills surrounding the village were not natural formations alone, but landscapes altered by decades of mining. Above Aberfan stood several coal spoil tips, massive piles of waste rock created as a byproduct of extraction. They grew gradually, year after year, becoming a permanent feature of the village skyline. Children walked to school beneath them. Homes were built below them. Over time, their presence faded into the background of daily life. But the tips were never stable. Built on porous ground, crossed by underground springs, they absorbed rainwater and slowly shifted. Residents noticed changes long before the disaster. Water seeped from the ground. Small slides occurred. Teachers, parents, and local officials raised concerns, writing letters and filing complaints. These warnings reached the National Coal Board, the authority responsible for the tips, and were recorded, reviewed, and ultimately dismissed. Engineers relied on outdated assumptions. Inspections were infrequent. Responsibility moved upward through layers of administration, where it gradually dissolved. Each year without incident reinforced the belief that the danger was theoretical, manageable, or simply exaggerated. By the mid-1960s, the tips had become an accepted risk, not because they were safe, but because they had always been there. On the morning of October 21, 1966, Aberfan followed its usual routine. Children gathered for school assembly. Parents went to work. The hills above the village were silent, heavy with rain from weeks of bad weather. Nothing appeared different. Nothing signaled urgency. Yet beneath the surface, water had weakened the structure of the spoiled tip above Panclas Junior School. What was about to happen was not sudden, nor unpredictable. It was the delayed result of long-standing warnings, normalized danger, and decisions made far from the people who would pay the price. The coal tips above Aberfan were not natural formations, but industrial structures built gradually from mining waste, without a clear long-term strategy for safety or stability. Each layer added weight, pressing down on ground that was already compromised by natural springs and poor drainage. Over time, rainwater seeped deep into the spoil, saturating the fine coal particles and weakening the internal structure from within. This process did not produce dramatic signs. There were no loud cracks or visible collapses, only subtle changes that were easy to overlook. Engineers within the National Coal Board believed spoil tips could be managed through routine inspections, but these inspections focused almost entirely on surface conditions. What lay beneath was largely ignored. Reports mentioning instability, water seepage, and movement were treated as technical notes rather than urgent warnings. The system relied heavily on past experience, and past experience suggested that major failures were unlikely. Responsibility for the tips was divided among departments and individuals, none of whom carried full authority or accountability. As concerns moved upward through the organization, they lost urgency, diluted by procedure and delay. Local residents continued to notice changes on the hillside, including water flowing where it had not before, but their observations carried little weight in a system that prioritized internal assessments over lived experience. Minor slips in nearby areas were recorded but dismissed as manageable events, not signals of escalating risk. Each year, without disaster, reinforced a sense of normality. The tips became part of the accepted environment, their presence no longer questioned. What went unrecognized was that stability was not fixed. With each period of heavy rain, the balance shifted slightly, unseen and unmeasured. By the mid-1960s, the spoil tip above Panclas Junior School was no longer merely a potential hazard. It was a structure under sustained internal stress, supported more by assumption than by evidence, and held in place not by engineering certainty, but by the belief that nothing serious had happened before. In the days before October 21st, 1966, South Wales experienced prolonged and unrelenting rainfall. The valleys absorbed weeks of water, and the coal spoil tips above Aberfan took in far more than they could release. Rainwater seeped deep into the fine coal waste, feeding underground springs that had long existed beneath the hillside. This process was gradual and largely invisible, but its effects were cumulative. As water filled the lower layers of the tip, pressure increased, weakening the internal structure from within. On the surface, subtle changes began to appear. Sections of the tip settled unevenly. Darker patches of damp material emerged. To trained eyes, these signs suggested movement, but such observations did not automatically lead to intervention. At the colliery, workers noticed minor shifts early that morning, yet movement in spoil tips was not uncommon and rarely treated as an emergency. There was no clear threshold that demanded immediate action, no protocol that required the area below to be evacuated. Decision-making relied heavily on experience, and experience suggested that nothing catastrophic would happen without warning. Meanwhile, in the village below, the morning unfolded as it always had. Children arrived at Panclas Junior School and gathered for assembly. Teachers organized the day ahead. Parents left their homes, unaware that the ground above them had already lost stability. The danger was not perceived as imminent because it did not announce itself loudly or dramatically. The system depended on visible failure to justify response, and at that moment, failure was occurring internally, beyond sight. What had been developing for years now accelerated quietly. The spoil at the base of the tip began to behave less like solid ground and more like a fluid mass, held in place only by friction and habit. By the time anyone might have recognized the urgency of the situation, the process had already moved past the point where observation could lead to prevention. The disaster was no longer forming. It was already set in motion, waiting only for gravity to complete what neglect and delay had begun. Shortly after 9 o'clock that morning, the internal failure within the spoil tip reached its final stage. The saturated material at the base could no longer support the weight above it, and the hillside gave way without warning. What had appeared solid moments before suddenly collapsed, releasing thousands of tons of coal waste in a matter of seconds. The spoil did not slide slowly. It liquefied. Driven by gravity and water, it surged downhill like a dark, heavy wave, accelerating as it moved. The mass followed a path shaped by years of dumping and natural channels in the hillside, gathering speed as it descended toward the village. Within moments, the flow reached Aberfan. Houses at the edge of the village were struck first, engulfed almost instantly. The force carried onward, crossing roads and walls as if they did not exist. When it reached Panclas Junior School, the building was in the middle of its morning routine. Children were seated inside, teachers present, the day only just beginning. The spoil crashed into the structure with overwhelming force, collapsing classrooms and burying the school beneath meters of debris. The entire sequence unfolded in less than a minute. There was no time to react, no opportunity to escape. The sound was described by witnesses as a deep roar, followed by sudden silence. When the movement stopped, the landscape had been completely transformed. Where the school had stood, there was now a mound of black waste. Streets were unrecognizable. Familiar landmarks vanished beneath the debris. The disaster had ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind devastation that could not yet be fully understood, and a village facing a reality that would define it forever. In the moments after the spoil came to rest, Aberfan was left in a state of stunned silence. Dust hung in the air, and the scale of what had happened was not immediately clear. Survivors began to move instinctively toward the site, climbing over debris with bare hands, calling out names, listening for any sound beneath the mass of coal waste. Parents, neighbors, miners from nearby collieries, and emergency workers converged on the area within minutes, driven by urgency rather than coordination. Tools were scarce, machinery was slow to arrive, and much of the early rescue effort relied on physical labor and determination. As hours passed, the reality became increasingly apparent. The school had been buried almost entirely, leaving little space where survival was possible. Rescue teams worked carefully, aware that further movement of the spoil could cause additional collapses. The atmosphere was heavy, marked by exhaustion, fear, and moments of quiet hope that were often followed by loss. Throughout the village, homes had been damaged or destroyed, and families searched for loved ones without clear information. Communication was fragmented, and official responses struggled to keep pace with the emotional and physical demands of the scene. Despite the overwhelming circumstances, the community continued to dig, guided by the belief that time still mattered. What unfolded that day was not only a rescue operation, but a collective act of grief and resolve, as Aberfan faced the immediate consequences of a disaster that had taken its children and irrevocably altered the life of the village. As the rescue effort continued, attention slowly turned toward understanding how the disaster had been allowed to happen. In the days following the collapse, officials from the National Coal Board and government representatives arrived in Aberfan, offering statements of sympathy and assurances of support. Yet behind these public gestures, questions began to surface almost immediately. Residents knew the spoil tips had been a concern long before the disaster, and many had warned authorities about water and instability on the hillside. These warnings were now impossible to ignore. A formal inquiry was announced, tasked with determining the cause of the collapse and identifying responsibility. As evidence was gathered, a clear pattern emerged. The spoil tip that destroyed Pancla's junior school had been placed on ground known to contain natural springs, a fact recorded in earlier surveys. Inspections had failed to account for internal saturation, focusing instead on surface appearance. Safety procedures were vague, and no clear system existed for responding to signs of instability. Most critically, responsibility within the National Coal Board was dispersed across multiple levels, allowing decisions to be delayed or avoided altogether. As testimony accumulated, it became evident that the disaster was not the result of a single error or unforeseeable event. It was the outcome of neglect, poor oversight, and a culture that prioritized production over precaution. For the people of Aberfan, the inquiry represented more than an administrative process. It was a search for accountability, an attempt to understand how long-standing warnings had been acknowledged and yet still ignored, and whether those responsible would finally be held to account. In the weeks following the disaster, Aberfan entered a period of collective mourning unlike anything the village had known before. Funerals followed one another in rapid succession, often with multiple children buried on the same day. The cemetery filled with rows of small graves, each marking a life lost before it had properly begun. Families grieved not only privately, but together, bound by a shared absence that touched every street and every household. The scale of the loss drew national and international attention. Messages of sympathy arrived from around the world, along with donations intended to support the bereaved families. Yet, even amid this outpouring of support, pain was compounded by confusion and frustration. Questions arose over how the relief funds would be managed, who would decide their distribution, and whether they could ever address the depth of what had been taken. For many in Aberfan, grief was inseparable from anger. The knowledge that the disaster had been preventable made mourning heavier, more complicated. Parents struggled not only with loss, but with the realization that warnings had gone unheeded. The village itself changed permanently. Familiar sounds were replaced by silence. Classrooms stood empty. Community rituals became reminders of absence. Aberfan was no longer simply a mining village. It had become a symbol of loss, known far beyond Wales, carrying the weight of its tragedy into the public consciousness. What remained was a community trying to endure, to remember, and to find meaning in a future shaped by an event that had redefined its past. In the years that followed, Aberfan did not fade into history as a single tragic moment, but remained a lasting reminder of the consequences of ignored responsibility. The inquiry concluded that the disaster had been entirely preventable, placing clear blame on the National Coal Board for its failures in management and oversight. Yet for many in the village, official conclusions offered limited comfort. No punishment could restore what had been lost, and accountability arrived long after the damage had been done. Over time, Aberfan became more than a place. It became a symbol, referenced whenever questions of safety, authority, and institutional responsibility were raised. Memorials were built, not to close the story, but to ensure it was not forgotten. The village itself continued, carrying both memory and absence into everyday life. Children grew up hearing the story of those who had not. Silence became part of the landscape, woven into routines and shared understanding. Aberfan's legacy lies not only in the disaster itself, but in what it revealed about how warnings can be acknowledged yet dismissed, how systems can function smoothly while failing those they are meant to protect, and how tragedy often emerges not from sudden chaos, but from long periods of neglect. The lesson of Aberfan is not confined to one village or one moment in time. It remains a quiet question, asked whenever risk is normalized and responsibility is deferred, waiting to see whether it will be heard before history repeats itself.